A Tolerable Arrangement. Written by the Darkavist. Read by Rashi. 1. Linhart had long lost track of what the argument du jour was about, but still, his gaze languidly moved from Ferdinand to Hubert, and back, based on who was louder at any given moment. Something, accountability, something greater good, something pragmaticism, something. Horses? Linhart yawned, wondering why Edelgard didn't tell them to shut up yet. Nobody had any respect for quiet study time. How was he supposed to sleep in the din? Hubert stayed seated in his chair, arms crossed over his chest. His voice was raised, but he managed to retain an outward appearance of calm, although his eyelid twitched now and then with barely restrained fury. Ferdinand, on the other hand, was standing, grasping at the edge of the table between him and Hubert. He looked about ready to jump over the table and strangle the mage with his bare hands. Finally, Hubert leaned up and said something to his classmate, too quietly for Linhart to overhear, but the effect was immediate. The young noble first turned sheet white, then bright red. He sputtered and pointed at Hubert, his voice echoing through the classroom. "I want a divorce!" Hubert shot up from his seat and snapped back. "We're not even married yet!" The ensuing silence was deafening. Linhart watched as both men sank back into their seats, regarding each other with mute horror. He had never felt more awake in his entire life. "I was under the impression we agreed to keep this a secret," Hubert hissed. The classroom exploded in questions. Break. In all the years they had known each other, that would be the first time Edelgard saw Hubert in such a state. He hid it well, but every now and then he took a deep breath, as if preparing to say something, and during those moments his mortification radiated off of him in waves. "Were you ever going to tell me?" she asked finally during dinner. She sat down her fork and folded her hands on her lap, waiting for an answer. "No, I wasn't," he admitted, and his shoulders sagged a little. "I assure you, it is a trifling matter that is hopefully being resolved as we speak. You see, our fathers made an agreement that Ferdinand would be wed to my sister, Sonia. That is no longer possible, as you know." Edelgard nodded, her expression somber. She had seen Sonia von Vestra but once or twice, due to the girl's poor health, but the news of her untimely passing still saddened her, if only for her friend's sake. Hubert saw the kind concern on his lady's face, and almost told her Sonia had, in fact, eloped with a maid. But he wouldn't, definitely not, until he got a note confirming they reached their destination in Morphis. "The wording of the agreement," Hubert continued, "was rather unfortunate. And so, in the absence of Sonia, an engagement is simply transferred onto the next available heir, which would be me." He took a sip of his coffee, and, for the first time in his life, wished it were something stronger. "Ferdinand wrote to his father, as I have to mine, and there's no doubt the whole agreement will be voided. It's taking a while, and I'm afraid they don't understand the urgency of the issue. But you needn't concern yourself with this. It changes nothing. Please, let's forget this ever happened." His eyes begged, as much as Hubert von Vestra was capable of begging. The news were beginning to spread in the academy that ran on prayers and gossip, and the only thing that brought him any comfort was the thought that the ridiculous engagement would be broken off before the week was over. 2 moons later, and neither of them received any encouraging news. It was the height of the social season, which kept both the Prime Minister and the Minister of the Imperial Household extremely busy, though for vastly different reasons, so it was to be expected, Ferdinand supposed. At least at the academy, their engagement became old news, and in their class, the whole thing became something of a joke, an unfunny joke that made Ferdinand want to crawl under the floor every time it was brought up, but a joke nonetheless. Alas, their professor seemed to take the whole thing as an encouragement to pair them up for tasks whenever possible. In the stables, Hubert was utterly useless, which irritated Ferdinand, but it also brought him a very ignoble degree of satisfaction. The mage worked in sullen silence. Ever since that unpleasant incident in the classroom, he barely acknowledged Ferdinand's presence. On one hand, it meant fewer arguments. On the other, what replaced them was thick, suffocating tension. Keeping a horse between them, Ferdinand put on a smile in an attempt to diffuse the situation a little. At least we weren't married in absentia. This should be easier to resolve. Our father should hurry up already. Hubert grumbled in response. It wasn't very graceful, but it wasn't downright hostile either. Little mercies. I would very much like to see the arrangement, Ferdinand noted. That caught his classmates' attention, because in the whirlwind of it all, it hadn't occurred to him. It should have. He should know better. In matters that didn't concern Ferdinand von Eyre, he usually did know better. I wonder who benefits from it. Not me, that's for sure, Hubert said gravely. Excuse me? Ferdinand was all injured sensibility now, golden eyes wide in shock. You would make a miserable husband, and you would be so fortunate to strike a match with someone like me. Fascinating, Hubert said flatly. Please, elaborate. He wasn't sure whether Ferdinand didn't understand sarcasm, or whether he simply chose to ignore it. But elaborate he did, and the already unpleasant shift at the stables was quickly turning into a lesson in advanced psychological torture. Well, I strongly believe that even if I didn't choose my spouse, they would be deserving of a baseline level of courtesy, Ferdinand stated, pointedly ignoring Hubert's expression, and I would do my best to make the arrangement work for both parties. While I personally would prefer to pursue a marriage on the basis of romantic affection, mutual respect and willingness to compromise might yield better long-term results. And with time and effort, who knows, a stranger could become a cherished partner. Despite himself, Hubert smirked. So what you're saying is that if we were to be wed, you would attempt to court me and hope for the best? How very... you. Ferdinand bristled at that, and he looked like he might stomp his foot any second now. Well, what would you do? I was thinking a boating accident. A strangled little sound escaped Ferdinand, and he tried to pass it off as a cough. That was in very poor taste, even for you. And yet you're trying not to laugh, Hubert observed, vaguely amused by the reaction. They finished their tasks in silence, each consumed by their own unsettling thoughts. Ferdinand imagining his own watery demise, Hubert imagining being wooed by Ferdinand von Eyre. 2. The news of his engagement did come with an unexpected advantage, though no advantage could be significant enough to make up for the embarrassment. But, as the ball dragged on, he found out that his unwillingness to dance was interpreted as some misguided loyalty to his, he cringed at the word, fiancé, and accepted without question. Left to his own devices, Hubert passed the hours on the balcony, trying not to think about all the work he could be getting done. Lady Edelgard, alas, insisted they attend, and he was under strict orders to stay, at least until the other members of their class started retiring for the night. So far, it had been the most pleasant social function he could remember. A figure stumbled out into the dark night, laughing, and with them came the hum of conversation and string music. Ferdinand made it to the balcony railing, and leaned heavily against it, a glass of sparkling white wine in hand. He was alight, smiling, and flushed with the alcohol and the excitement. "How many did you have?" Hubert asked. Ferdinand nearly jumped out of his skin, and spilled some of the wine into his hand. "Goddess! Hubert, how did you get here? You nearly gave me a heart attack." "As you may recall, I also attend this academy," Hubert said, sarcasm dripping from each syllable. He pried the glass from Ferdinand's hand and poured the contents over the railing. "Should you really be getting drunk in public?" "That was my first glass," Ferdinand pointed out, more than a little offended. Hubert leaned in and, fair enough, he couldn't smell any alcohol on his breath. Apparently some people didn't need to drink to be cheerful to the point of obnoxiousness. Ferdinand flushed a little at the sudden proximity, but pride wouldn't allow him to step away, and thus admit he was intimidated by von Vestra's presence. "Have you been here the entire evening?" Ferdinand asked, looking at Hubert through his eyelashes. "You needn't concern yourself with that." A dark chuckle. "Feel free to run along and have fun. I'm not the jealous type." Ferdinand flushed, in anger, and gently, but firmly, pushed him away. He cleared his throat, taking great care to look anywhere but at Hubert. "Your jokes are somehow progressively getting worse. I did not believe that to be possible." Fair enough. Hubert himself felt sick to his stomach just saying that, but his discomfort paled in comparison with the sheer glee Ferdinand's reaction inspired in him. He was handed an entirely new way to unsettle the brat, and it would be a waste not to take full advantage of it, especially since they were alone. And so he pushed forward. "If I recall correctly," he started, keeping his tone low and smooth, "you were the one proclaiming your eagerness to endear yourself to your intended, regardless of who they may be. Is that not so, beloved?" Ferdinand visibly cringed. "I swear to Goddess, Hubert, what is the matter? Is my dearest displeased for some reason?" The mage kept teasing. If he could force himself to overcome his revulsion, he'd reach for his hand then, but it seemed his words sufficed. Ferdinand looked like he wanted to stomp his foot or chuck something at Hubert, but after a second he composed himself again. He took a deep breath and granted the other his brightest smile. Hubert began to feel vaguely worried. No, you are right, of course. I should not have lost my temper like that." He gave a short bow and held out his hand. "Allow me to make it up to you on the dance floor." Hubert flinched, as if struck, while the noble looked at him expectantly. His lips were turned upwards in an approximation of a smile, but in his eyes was a challenge, clear as day. He couldn't truly believe Hubert would back off and lose face, could he? He accepted the proffered hand and allowed himself to be led into the ballroom. The sudden onslaught of lights, colors, and noise made him want to back away immediately and admit defeat for once, but he couldn't. Not yet. "I can only lead," Ferdinand said quietly, as he put a hand around Hubert's waist. "It's your funeral," he quipped back, but put his own hand on Ferdinand's shoulder. For all his faults, Ferdinand was a good dancer, although he kept chattering about who knows what as they waltzed through the next two songs. At times, his voice seemed to drown out even the music, but he wouldn't allow Hubert to lose rhythm. People were staring, but it was of no consequence. Soon, the next phase of Lady Edelgard's plan would commence, and after that, classroom gossip would no longer matter. Ferdinand von Eyre, with his boasting and arrogance and long eyelashes, had no place in the future they'd envisioned. 3. As the moons of war passed in an orderly queue, Hubert's workload tripled. It wasn't even 11 at night that he noticed the inconspicuous note in the stash of other correspondence. The handwriting was unmistakable. Elegant, clean, looping letters. "Please, come see me when you are free. There is a matter we need to discuss. F." He couldn't think of anything the noble could possibly want to do with him. Even more difficult he found it to imagine anything Ferdinand wouldn't simply tell him in person without preamble. The existence of the note by itself set off alarm bells in his head, and so he threw on a coat and stalked down the hallway, just to bang on Ferdinand's door, quite uselessly. Only then did it occur to him that Ferdinand was probably asleep already. Their schedules couldn't be more different, and there were entire days when they didn't see each other at all. He was about to return to his room when the door flew open, and a very disheveled Ferdinand poked his head out. "Oh, it's you. You shouldn't open the door without checking who it is first," Hubert chided, mostly out of habit, and pushed past Ferdinand into the room. "Do come in. Make yourself at home," the noble grumbled. Interesting. It seemed that being woken up at a perfectly reasonable hour brought out a new, far more irritable side of him. Hubert made himself comfortable on the one chair in the room, and waited for Ferdinand to put himself together again. The noble closed the door, lit a lamp, and took a seat on his bed. His hair was getting long, just about brushing his collar, and it framed his face in messy waves, a halo all askew. In an old white shirt and loose trousers, he looked far less prim, far less polished, and there was a particular sweetness to his expression, a vulnerability to be exploited by an assassin. Hubert corrected himself. An assassin that Ferdinand would even invite in. "Did you receive my message?" "Obviously." At that, Ferdinand visibly wilted. Rubbing his eyes, he reached under his pillow and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "The copy of our father's agreement. Mother sent it to me. The circumstances have changed," Hubert said quietly. "This no longer concerns us." The other shook his head and handed him the paper. "You'll want to read this." Then he promptly buried his face in his hands, all presentation abandoned for once in his innocent, sheltered life. Ever since Ferdinand brought it up one lazy spring afternoon, he sometimes wondered what kinds of bargaining chips changed hands between their fathers, who benefited from the arrangement, who was to be sacrificed for whose ambition. The document in his hands outlined years of blackmail and corruption, the depths of which he had long suspected but could never confirm. It still wasn't enough to shock Hubert. Nothing shocked him any more. "You should have destroyed it," Hubert said at last. Ferdinand looked up, and even in the dim light he looked like he was holding back tears. He shook his head and dropped his hands to his lap. "I didn't think it right to keep that from you." Not wise, not smart. Right. The determination to do the right thing, even when there was nothing to gain, and even through obvious, personal pain, seemed the pinnacle of foolishness to Hubert. But at the very least, he could count on Ferdinand to be consistent. Hubert tore the paper into long strips, summoned a small ball of flames, and fed it the pieces of paper until not even ashes remained. Ferdinand watched, but wouldn't meet Hubert's eyes, not until the flame was extinguished. "Don't trade your future for the past," Hubert said quietly. The faint fragrance of smoke lingered between them. 4. When Ferdinand first poked his head into Hubert's room, well, the one he knew about, his first instinct was to call either a healer or an undertaker. Hubert was resting atop his blanket, unseeing eyes fixed at the ceiling. The curtains were drawn, and aside from the square of sunshine Ferdinand let in, there were no other sources of light. Hubert growled, as if just opening his mouth caused him a great deal of pain. Close the damn door. All right, that one was on him. He should have specified that Ferdinand was meant to close the door and stay on the other side of it. Instead, the knight took that as an invitation to stay in Hubert's bedroom and make himself comfortable on the one available chair. The mere sound of the piece of furniture scraping against the floors made Hubert wince. "What are you even doing here?" he croaked. "Oh, I just came to see if you needed any help," Ferdinand explained. Upon seeing the expression that flashed over Hubert's face at the volume, he, thankfully, showed the good sense to tone himself down as he continued, "Edelgard told us not to expect you around for a day or two, because you were away to attend some extremely secret business, and you interpreted it as me requiring assistance because—" Ferdinand shrugged. "Well, if it were true, why would she tell us about it?" "Sometimes I forget you're not a complete idiot." He really needed to talk to Lady Edelgard about the subtle art of cover stories at some point. That almost sounded like a compliment. "Hubert, are you actually dying?" The maid shut his eyes painfully and placed one hand over them. Even so, the pain hammering against his forehead was bright and blinding. "I certainly feel like it. But no, I am not." Anything I can do to help?" Ferdinand asked softly, but when there was no response, he continued, I don't believe you were injured in the last skirmish, or am I mistaken?" "No, you are correct." Hubert sighed. He didn't know if it was Ferdinand's sickeningly kind concern or the pain clouding his judgment, but he spoke up again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You see, there are more things than crests that travel through bloodlines. There's a hereditary affliction in the family. It doesn't manifest in every member, and I exhibit only a faintly mild form of it. But occasionally, it makes certain everyday matters needlessly difficult." "That's not too uncommon in noble families," Ferdinand conceded, "but I'd assume you'd rather not have it known, especially now. That would be for the best. Does it happen frequently? Is there something that could be done to lessen the vexation? Discreetly, of course." Hubert let out an ugly cackle, which he immediately regretted. Quiet. He needed quiet, and no sudden movements. Invoking fiancé privileges? Invoking ally privileges? Either way, I'm afraid there is nothing you can do. This vexation, you called it, is triggered by exposure to sunlight. Did you? If the next thing out of your mouth relates to vampires in any shape or form, I will kill you." "No! I wanted to ask if the professor knows." "No, only Lady Edelgard does. And now you. As you've said, I do not wish this to become common knowledge." Hubert let out a deep sigh and stretched his fingers. Ferdinand realized he'd never seen him without his gloves, though he couldn't make out much of his hands in the darkness. "It is of no consequence. I take every precaution at my disposal. It is very rare for me to be reduced to this state." Without thinking, Ferdinand put his hand over Hubert's. The mage winced and quickly withdrew his hand. "Please don't. Not right now." The right now was just a slip of the tongue, a mistake. "My apologies. I didn't mean to cause you pain." To Ferdinand's undeniable shock, Hubert placed one of his hands into his, and only then he understood. His fingers were covered in blisters, some clear, some purplish and filled with red liquid. Even his skin felt hot to the touch. After a moment, Hubert pulled his hand back once more stubbornly looking anywhere but at his companion. He understood, or at least he believed he did. The part Hubert played didn't allow for vulnerability. Ferdinand wanted to reassure him, to tell him he didn't have to pretend. But weren't they all pretending? Sunlight, Ferdinand said softly. Of all things, sunlight. Once it starts, some things may make it worse as well. Light, bright colors, loud noises. Hubert's lips twitched in an approximation of a smile. Everything you are, I'm afraid. In the dark, Hubert couldn't see the red creeping up Ferdinand's cheeks, but his eyes kept following the wave of honey-blonde hair, liquid silk in the darkness. It hung over Ferdinand's shoulder like a curtain, like sunlight that warmed but didn't sear. Would it smell like sunshine too? Would it burn him if he dared to touch it? Suddenly, there was a strange, static-like sensation enveloping one of his hands. Cool, but familiar. Green glow, faint in the overwhelming darkness of the room. Faint, but there nonetheless. I didn't know you studied faith magic, Hubert mumbled, feeling the relief of healing magic wash over him. I only started recently, he explained quickly, shifting his attention to the other hand. Our professor suggested I try for the Holy Knight certification. Let's think of this as extra training. Some of the pain subsided, but what replaced it was exhaustion that seemed to seep through his flesh into the marrow of his bones. He didn't want to feel that way. Tired, weak, a thing to be pitied. Pity. The word sank into his stomach and uncurled there, spreading itself until Hubert thought it might choke him. He didn't need pity, especially not from the likes of someone who wasn't even supposed to be there in the first place. He had assumed that Ferdinand von Eyre would stand against them, quite uselessly, of course. He wasn't supposed to be there, extending his sympathy to Hubert, as though he should feel flattered to receive it. Honored, even. As the pain dissipated, exhaustion took its place. Exhaustion and resentment. He resented Ferdinand, but not as much as he resented himself in that moment. Resentment. Regret. He never meant to reveal that much. Anything else I can do? He never meant to reveal anything at all. Just go. Hubert, now! To his credit, Ferdinand did get up, confused as he was by the sudden shift in Hubert's mood. He half expected him to sit there and argue. He half wanted him to sit there and argue, provided he could keep his voice down. Against his face, the pillow felt cool and soft, but somehow it was as if he couldn't bury his face deep enough into it. Really, being smothered by a reasonably comfortable pillow sounded like a dream right about now. Ferdinand paused at the door and looked over his shoulder. I'll return later. You don't need to. Don't make me invoke fiancé privileges. With truly heroic effort, Hubert threw a pillow at him, but it only hit the door as Ferdinand slipped out. 5. Hubert couldn't hear their conversation, but he didn't need to. He had to admit that Ferdinand and Dorothea made a lovely couple. In a strange way, a remarkably suitable match, too. They were standing in the tea garden, both so incandescent with happiness that he almost averted his eyes. She held both of his hands in her own, speaking rapidly, as though she were about to burst into song at any moment. A rare sight those days. The war had been hard on her, and it was a relief to see her smiling again. Ferdinand leaned down and kissed her on the forehead. He said something too. Dorothea laughed and playfully slapped his arm. Then she left. Ferdinand watched her go with unmasked fondness. Yes, they were good for each other, Hubert thought to himself grimly. Ferdinand looked in Hubert's direction, although the mage knew he was not visible from that point, shook his head and said, laughing, "You can come out now. I must be getting sloppy." Hubert abandoned his spot in the shadows and joined Ferdinand, who motioned for him to sit on one of the benches littering the monastery gardens. Hubert kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, but he had to ask. He needed the confirmation. "I take it congratulations are in order? Excuse me?" Ferdinand sounded genuinely dumbfounded. We aren't... You misunderstood. Dorothea simply received some good news. Good news of the personal variety. Good news I'm not at the liberty to share at the moment." Hubert shouldn't feel so relieved Ferdinand didn't propose to Dorothea. It shouldn't matter to him at all. Maybe he'd grown too accustomed to the presence of the other general, and wasn't quite ready to accommodate any changes to the dynamic they'd developed. Well, should you choose to pursue some unfortunate soul romantically, feel free to. I have renounced my claim years ago." He tried to joke. He thought about the contract turning into ash under the force of his magic. How strangely everything turned out in the end. "There is someone," Ferdinand began haltingly, "but I'm afraid that my feelings for them are one-sided, perhaps even unwelcome." "How operatic." Hubert rolled his eyes, and finally faced his companion. "Though, if my opinion counts for anything in that matter, it is their loss. As a fiancé you are... tolerable." Ferdinand turned his head away, and covered his mouth, laughing. "I truly need you to stop doing this. It sounds so strange coming from you." "You don't have a monopoly on the use of pointlessly flowery language," Hubert quipped back, not even trying to conceal his smirk. Then he added, for good measure, "Dearest?" The word tasted foreign in his mouth, but it didn't fill him with the same revulsion it had some years ago. And then, to his horror, he realized he meant it. He shot up from the bench. "Is everything all right?" Ferdinand inquired. "If you will excuse me," Hubert said at the same time. He gave a curt bow, one hand over his rapidly beating heart. "I remember there is an urgent matter I need to attend to. But you will meet me for tea, won't you? Only if you promise not to make me drink any." And at that point, Hubert should have left, because clearly his poor attempt at humour encouraged Ferdinand to mimic it, not to be outdone, not even in stupidity. He fluttered his eyelashes, and barely holding back laughter, choked out, "You have my word, sweetheart." He should have attempted that boating accident when he had the chance. "Hubert, only after your departure, it occurred to me that we had stumbled, quite accidentally, across the perfect password, should we ever find ourselves in a situation that would require one. Of course, that means you won't be able to use terms of endearment to tease me, but that is not a great loss as far as I am concerned. In return, I promise not to call you a sweetheart, or anything of that sort, unless I suspect we've found ourselves in mortal peril. That name does not suit you anyway. Maybe I will come up with a more appropriate one. One of those lazy afternoons. Best regards, Ferdinand von Eyre." "Ferdinand, your suggestion, is not without its merits. Still, you should reconsider, as you run the risk of giving the person possessing the dubious gift of your affection the wrong impression. If your own foolishness ruins your chances, expect no sympathy from me." "Sweetheart fits you much better than it could ever fit one such as myself. So does beloved, beloved by so many, often against their own will. Doesn't it get exhausting? Sincerely, H." "Hubert, I was greatly saddened to hear you were busy taking inventory of your extensive poison collection and will not join us until tomorrow. I suspect Edelgard was particularly proud of this one. Should you require any assistance, do not hesitate to let me know. Best regards, Ferdinand von Eyre. I could use a test subject. H. Plus. Peacetime, as it turned out, required the kind of diplomacy that stretched Hubert's already overworked patience to its very limit. After the big players in Adrestia were all replaced, they were still left with the heaps of squabbling nobles with delusions of relevance. Lady Edelgard was seated across from Count Boleslav and his secretary, nodding politely as the man droned on, pouring tea into precious porcelain cups that probably cost more than what he paid all of his servants in a year. Why Lady Edelgard consented to make a detour on her trip to Nouvelle for that, Hubert would never understand. Ferdinand, seated at the Empress's other side, seemed to be listening intently to all that drivel, but Hubert knew his ever-shifting moods too well not to notice the glassiness of his eyes. He picked up his teacup and took a second to appreciate the aroma, and some of his usual alertness returned to his expression. "This scent is exquisite," he announced, interrupting their host. "Almiron pine needles?" Count Boleslav seemed taken aback, but recovered quickly. "Yes, that is correct. Well observed." "Oh, I am fond of this tea," he explained with a chuckle. He looked at Hubert and slightly raised an eyebrow. "You shouldn't force yourself, though. Love?" Then he laughed again, a laugh more perfect than the real thing. He turned his attention back to their host. "You see, our dear minister never learnt to appreciate the more refined flavors. It's a genuine tragedy. Right, dearest?" Just in those 10 seconds, Ferdinand went against good manners so many times he may as well have set the curtains in the parlor on fire. But Hubert understood. Hubert offered the nobleman a grim little smile as he slipped one hand behind his back, readying a miasma spell should the situation escalate. "Do not mind Minister Eyre. It seems to have slipped his mind that the imperial protocol establishes that the first cup is for the host to enjoy." By then, Lady Edelgard caught on as well, as she pushed her tea away, maintaining eye contact with Count Boleslav. To his credit, he didn't move a muscle. "I've never heard of such a tradition." "It's not a tradition per se," the Empress replied airily, "but apparently I am allowed to have my whims now and then." She folded her hands in her lap and added, in the tone of someone whose orders are not to be questioned, "Drink." By the time they fought their way out, the empty teacup was in pieces, crushed under the weight of the poisoned man. There was a joke somewhere in there about Ferdinand's tea-related snobbery finally paying off, but try as he might, Ferdinand couldn't find it. All that he could focus on was that he and, more importantly, Lady Edelgard were almost poisoned, and weren't it for his, and weren't it for Ferdinand, that would probably be the end. And he would suspect nothing. Such a lapse in judgment wasn't like him. Perhaps in his relentless pursuit of those who slither in the dark, it slipped his mind that there were still the ordinary dangers of unchecked ambition, simmering resentment and revenge. Had they dealt with Ferdinand von Eyre according to the initial plan, Ferdinand von Eyre with his pretty eyelashes, his awful sense of humor, and infuriating mannerisms, his blindingly bright mind, his determination to oppose everyone and everything, his hand holding Hubert's heart, he would be dead. And so would they. "You've been awfully quiet," Ferdinand remarked, as he helped Hubert into the saddle. Not that Hubert needed the assistance. It was just easier to simply accept it. "You should try it sometimes. Make me." Hubert looked down at Ferdinand, who was standing by the mage's horse, one hand still lightly clasped around Hubert's. He made no move to pull away. Ferdinand was looking up at him, his face carefully blank, a question And a challenge. "I—" Hubert started. Edelgard cleared her throat. "We need to get going if we are to reach Nouvelle before midnight." Nouvelle could burn, as far as Hubert was concerned, but his lady's voice yanked him back to reality nevertheless. Ferdinand shot him a quick smile and mounted his own horse, while Hubert avoided meeting Lady Edelgard's eyes. They did not talk about any of what had transpired throughout the rest of the journey. They did not acknowledge it in Nouvelle. They did not breathe a word out of line on their way back. Therefore, although the idea of a business left unfinished grated at Hubert's nerves, he considered the whole affair as good as concluded. And so, it didn't particularly surprise him to find Ferdinand sitting in his office, or at least the office Ferdinand knew about, with a steaming cup of tea. A cup of coffee waited for Hubert at his desk. "I believe I gave you the key to my office for emergencies only," Hubert remarked, although he had known from the start Ferdinand would let himself in whenever he pleased. That way, at least, he wouldn't have to replace his door every month or so. "The matter I wish to discuss with you is urgent," Ferdinand insisted, as he rose from the sofa near the fireplace. Only then did Hubert notice the black folder in his hand. That gave him pause. Ferdinand could be extremely particular about certain things, not the things one would expect, but his folders and stationery were, apparently, one of those things. Red for documents pertaining to his work, green for personal matters, blue for poetry, and those were not to be touched, and orange for miscellaneous. Black. Well, that was a new one. "Are you here to request a political assassination?" Hubert joked. It was mostly a joke. At least, half a joke. "If I am not mistaken, you are entitled to 3 of those a year, unless Her Majesty approves an increase. That wasn't a very nice joke. I'm not a very nice man." Hubert picked up his coffee and sat down on the sofa, motioning for Ferdinand to join him, which he did. "You have my attention." The other took a deep breath and set the folder down on his knees, keeping his hand over it protectively. Hubert reached out and gently removed the teacup from Ferdinand's trembling hand before he could spill the tea. It wasn't like him to be so nervous. "There is something that has been on my mind for a while now, but after that incident near Nouvelle, I believe we must address it. I talked to Edelgard, and she concedes that this might be the best course of action. If you agree." "Agree with what?" Hubert asked, and took a sip of coffee. "Perhaps it was a mistake to cancel our engagement." Hubert spat out his coffee. "What?" Then, like a man drowning, he quickly reviewed Ferdinand's words, grasping for a thread he could follow. "You talked to Lady Edelgard about this, and she agreed?" Hubert knew, she knew, he knew, she knew about his feelings for Ferdinand. But still, once she stopped laughing, yes. He wiped a drop of coffee from the folder. "I assumed that might be a concern for you." He was right about that, but there was no way Hubert would admit that aloud. He glanced at the folder, then looked at Ferdinand, and raised an eyebrow. The noble nodded quickly, and pulled out a sheet of paper. "I took the liberty of compiling a list of reasons as to why an arrangement is only logical and all-around beneficial to Adrestia." Ferdinand's voice became steadier now, and Hubert suspected he rehearsed that little speech. He himself was too stunned to shepherd some words together into an answer. It would be easy to say yes. He wanted to say yes. "It is not that anything would have to change. The way things are now is perfectly agreeable to me. That said, we do our best work when we act as a unit, and, therefore, it only stands to reason that—" Hubert raised his hand to stop the flow of words. "Does everything on that list of yours follow a similar logic?" Ferdinand nodded. "I see." Hubert got up from the sofa and sat behind the desk and started rearranging his pens, just to give himself something to do with his hands. There may be some deranged kind of sense in your suggestion, but I cannot let you do this to yourself. I know what I'm doing. A deep sigh. Hubert, you never tried to spare my feelings. Don't start now. If you're against the idea, just say so, and I promise to never bring it up again. You misunderstand. Hubert rested his hands on the top of the desk, looking at the worn leather of his gloves. I know you always intended to marry for love. You shouldn't throw away that option. Is that your counter-argument? Hubert von Vestra, championing for romance? Hubert cracked a smile. He wanted to be selfish and accept Ferdinand's strange proposal, but he couldn't risk Ferdinand's future happiness in the process. It seemed so. The other's expression shifted. He almost looked victorious. Well, Hubert, if you haven't noticed, I've been in love with you for years. Counter this. A long pause. And it didn't occur to you to start with that? I was under the impression that you knew. Ferdinand defended himself, a faint blush dusting his cheeks. I told you as much when Dorothea got engaged, and you were concerned that... It dawned on him then. Ferdinand mentioned a person, and that his feelings for them were unrequited, unwelcome even. He sagged in the chair a little more, memories of previous conversations shifting and realigning themselves in light of that confession. I could never imagine that someone might be loved by you, and not love you back. Finally, he met Ferdinand's eyes. He faced dangers most people could hardly imagine. One man shouldn't make his voice tremble like that. I never entertained the idea that you could ever think of me that way. Ferdinand, there has always been an excess of history between us. I resigned myself to the fact that my affection would remain unspoken. After all, Ferdinand should know better. He knew how little light Hubert could bear. We didn't fight this hard to trade our futures for the past, Ferdinand said softly. He got up from the sofa and leaned against the edge of Hubert's desk. He turned the list of reasons as to why their marriage was a perfectly sensible step around, and set the blank page in front of the spymaster. We can make our own rules. He cracked a grin that had no business being as charming as it was. In fact, I'd like to have it in writing that a boating accident is no longer on the table. Hubert picked up a pen and smiled, unable to resist. What? Is drowning not good enough for you? Ferdinand patted him on the shoulder. I'm a better swimmer than you. It would be embarrassing for us both. That was a very strong argument. And so, Hubert wrote down the first rule of their contract. 1. I, Hubert von Vestra, swear that Ferdinand von Eyre will not be the victim of a mysterious, water-related accident unless caused by myself or an unaffiliated third party. Do I also get to make demands? Yes, of course. 2. I, Ferdinand von Eyre, swear that should Hubert von Vestra meet his demise before me, I will destroy all of his private correspondence. 7. In my absence, it is your duty to prevent Her Majesty from coming up with any cover stories. 15. No more balloon trousers. I swear to Goddess. 23. No horses on the furniture. 24. That includes ponies. 25. That includes Lawrence Helman Gloucester. 26. No unprovoked antagonizing of Lawrence Helman Gloucester. 58. At least one outing per moon that has nothing to do with work. 59. Said outings cannot involve opera more than 3 times in a row. 99. I love you. 100. Ferdinand von Eyre is to stay on topic for the duration of these negotiations. I love you too. Said negotiations took the rest of the day, several sheets of paper, and before they were done, Hubert tasted more tea than he usually would in a week, though not from a cup. They moved to the sofa, and the floor around them was littered with the promises they made. There was a smudge of ink on Ferdinand's cheek, from when Hubert cradled his face in his hands, and Hubert was feeling uncharacteristically optimistic about the future. Apparently, resting his head against Ferdinand's shoulder did wonders for his morale. Then, Ferdinand had the audacity to move. I forgot! A black velvet box was shoved into Hubert's hand. He didn't need to look to know what was inside. You came prepared, Hubert commented stiffly, but made no move to open it. You know how I feel about unreciprocated gifts. Ferdinand's thoroughly kissed lips smiled, but his eyes grew tense. I was hoping you'd make an exception this time. His smile wilted a little when Hubert stood up and marched back to his desk. Then his eyes widened in disbelief and delight when a similar little box was dropped in his lap. He opened his mouth, but Hubert knew what he was about to ask. After he made it abundantly clear that he never imagined, not even in his wildest dreams, that his feelings might be returned, why would he have in his possession a ring he would never be able to give to its intended recipient? There was no doubt it was made for Ferdinand. It wouldn't fit another hand. The garnet in the center gleamed even in the scant light, a dark, deep red. Hubert cleared his throat and seated himself next to his fiancée, removing his gloves. I knew that, realistically, the chances of fondness being mutual were slim. But you hoped, despite everything. Hope is a bad habit. Hubert gave Ferdinand the black box and offered him his hand, and I caught it from you. The ring Ferdinand slid around his finger fit perfectly.